Assalamu alaikum. Good evening.
Assalamu alaikum.
First of all, I want to thank all of the sponsors for this event for affording me this opportunity to come here and share with the political capital in the room. And I mean that very seriously. I have a copy of my book here, and it has an asterisk on it because this is my copy at home. And every time I read through it, I find something I don't like or that I should have said differently. So there's all kinds of little marginal notes there. So I'm looking forward to making some more marginal notes tonight based on your own intellectual capital. The second thing I want to say is that I really want to thank Professor Surush for coming out and being willing to share his intellectual capital with us. I'm sure it'll be of great benefit. I'm a little worried about the time, so I'm going to try and just jump in here and start my talk. My book, The Islamic Secular, is over 500 pages long, as you just heard. In many ways, it's a very technical book, both in terms of its basic argument and how I present it. At the same time, my thesis is mildly counterintuitive: the Islamic secular. Two words that many people, especially many Muslims, don't think belong in the same phrase. Obviously, I can't cover every aspect of my thesis in the 30 minutes or so that I've been allotted. What I hope to be able to do, however, is to introduce the basic foundations upon which I build my thesis and some of the most important implications of it. I'm going to try to keep things simple, and I hope that in doing so, I don't end up distorting my argument or, worse yet, confusing you. Of course, none of what I say here tonight could substitute for a full reading of the book. Now, before I go any further, I want to properly frame my argument. This will entail two basic points. First, I am not among those who see the future of Islam as depending on whether or not Muslims are able to prove that everything the West counts as its signature achievement or the basis of its success is also present or should be present in Islam. As many of us know, scholars such as Bernard Lewis, Samuel P. Huntington, and others have argued that it was the West's ability to secularize on the one hand and Islam's inability to secularize on the other that explains the West's progress and Islam's stagnation. I want to make it clear, however, that the Islamic secular is not an attempt to respond to this charge by arguing that Islam actually did or can secularize just like the West did. As I hope to make clear, the Islamic secular is not simply another version of the reigning understanding of secular in the West with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim attached to the front in order to Islamicize it. The second point I want to make is that we should be careful about thinking that Islam can be properly defined or understood in terms of what the West is not. We know that the West secularized. We also know that according to some, Muslims and non-Muslims alike, Islam is supposed to be the categorical opposite of the West. On this understanding, the secular must be an exclusively Western category, and Islam can have nothing to do with it if it wants to remain Islam. Anyone who even suggests otherwise is either being dishonest, naive, or perhaps even worse. From my perspective, whatever Islam and the West happen to have in common, either as a function of Islam's inherent nature or as a function of what it came to embrace over its 1,400-year history, including what it borrowed or appropriated from others, should neither be denied nor exaggerated, any more than we should deny or exaggerate what Islam held in common with pre-Islamic pagan Arabia. For Islam to share this or that feature with the West or the pagan Arabians does not make Islam any less Islam nor any less authentic as Islam. Nor should Muslims fall into the trap of essentially allowing the West to define Islam by the West's claiming that X is Western and therefore Islam must be not X. Muslims should define Islam rather on their own terms. I say this only to clear the air and to prepare us to hear some things that we might not otherwise be prepared to hear. The fact of the matter is that the Islamic secular does not derive its substance nor status from the West. It emerges out of discourses within Islam that are over 1,000 years old. I'm speaking here of the pre-modern Islamic juristic tradition known as usul al-fiqh, which, as we will see, supplies the basic building blocks out of which the Islamic secular is constructed. So now, what is the Islamic secular? I begin by acknowledging that the word secular is a product of the West and is not native to Islam. In fact, the word did not come into Arabic until the 19th century. For some, this alone would be enough to dismiss the Islamic secular as a foreign intrusion. But we might remind ourselves that faith, theology, feminism, democracy, law, as in Islamic law, even religion, are also not native to Islam. And just as Muslims and non-Muslims have adjusted these terms as part of the process of applying them to Islam, the same applies for secular. Now, with regard to the secular as it developed in the West, we must distinguish between two distinct modes of the secular, what I call the macro mode and the micro mode. The macro mode is basically the secular as it is most commonly understood. This secular denies the existence of God, the idea of the hereafter, and ultimately the validity of religion as a human enterprise. It is based on what thinkers such as Max Weber, Charles Taylor, Peter Berger, and others have in mind when they speak of the disenchantment of the world and the rise of the mechanistic view of the universe. According to this view, prior to the Enlightenment and the rise of modern science, humans experienced the world as a place filled with sprites and spirits and all kinds of charged forces, which humans believed affected the destiny of their lives, positively or negatively. In fact, the belief that one could get on the right side of these forces and stay away from the bad side of these forces is what gave rise to religion. Religion, in other words, depended heavily on the belief in the existence of these forces and the idea that God was their author. Getting right with God was the best, if not only way, to stay on the right side of these forces. The Enlightenment and then modern science came along, however, and reduced belief in such forces to ashes, essentially dismissing it as childish fairy tales. This quickly led to the world being emptied of these forces, or again to the disenchantment of the world. Without these spiritually charged forces, there was no need for any religious activity to get on their right side and stay away from their wrong side. Religion became irrelevant, as all the sprites and spirits that used to inspire religious feeling and prompt the search for God simply disappeared. This left us with a world that has an internal order and a mechanically driven mode of operation, but no creator. Now, this macro understanding of the secular, which denies both God and religion, is what is commonly meant and understood when people use the term secular, or is often commonly understood. In other words, secular generally means non-religious or anti-religious. This is why so many Muslims balk at the notion of an Islamic secular. But the macro secular is not the only understanding of secular, even in the West. The second understanding, what I call the micro mode, neither challenges nor denies the existence of God or the validity of religion. In fact, it acknowledges both. It simply seeks to limit the application of what God says by way of revelation to specific areas of human life. In other words, while the micro-secular recognizes God's existence and authority, it insists that God's scripture not be taken as the basis for regulating certain areas of life, most particularly politics, economics, and science. This restricting of what God says to certain areas of life is what scholars of religion refer to as differentiation. In other words, even if one believes in God and accepts God's authority in general, certain areas of life are to be governed by an authority that is differentiated or distinguished from the authority of Scripture. This goes back at least as far as the Protestant Reformation. The whole aim of differentiation was to liberate certain disciplines from the dictates and limitations of revelation, which was seen as stifling progress. Again, the micro-secular fully recognizes God and only seeks to limit the application of God's self-disclosures. Thus, even many early modern churchmen openly embraced differentiation. Luther, for example, is reported to have said, and I quote, "The world would be reduced to chaos if men tried to govern by the gospel." End of quote. In sum, unlike the macro-secular, the micro-secular has no problem with God or the general authority of religion or Scripture. It merely seeks to limit the application of Scripture to certain areas of life. Like the macro-secular, however, the micro-secular sees itself as constituting a non-religious domain. And we're still talking about the West here. Religion, and I don't think we can conceal the Protestant contribution here, was understood to be the application of Scripture. Differentiation, meanwhile, was simply meant to limit that application to certain areas of life. In other words, regarding certain areas of life, religion, or acting upon God's revelation, simply stays out. This is an extremely important point to apprehend in any attempt to understand the Islamic secular. Both the macro-secular and the micro-secular, as they developed in the West, were non-religious categories by definition. The whole point of the secular, macro or micro, was to separate what can or should be governed by religion or God's revelation from what cannot or should not be governed by these. Now, the argument of the Islamic secular is that traditional Islamic religious discourses, again going back over 1,000 years, recognizes a mode of differentiation, according to which God's self-disclosures, that is what God says, which Muslims process as Sharia, cannot be understood to speak concretely and authoritatively to every human contingency. This does not mean that Sharia is restricted to certain areas of life, as the Western secular does with religion in general. On the contrary, Sharia is relevant to all areas of life, and all areas of life come under Sharia's jurisdiction in the form of coming under one of Sharia's 5 legal statuses: forbidden, discouraged, neutral, recommended, or obligatory. The question, however, is how Sharia speaks to all areas of life. Simply stated, this thing is really in my way. I can't see my paper, I'm sorry. There you go. Sorry. Simply stated, and this is pre-modern Muslim jurists speaking here, not me, Sharia can provide a hukm shari, or a legal ruling, for everything in life. But legal rulings speak not to the effectiveness or utility of an act in the here and now, but primarily to how God will reward or punish or pardon an act in the hereafter. In this capacity, legal rulings, or ahkam shar'iyya, do not tell us everything we need to know in order to instantiate Islam's praxis, that is, to practice Islam in ways that are pleasing to both us and God. It is this area beyond or outside what the hukm shari can tell us about otherworldly consequences of our actions that I see as a differentiated realm, in the sense that Sharia does not speak to this realm in concrete terms. And it is this area that I refer to as the Islamic secular. In fact, I should perhaps give my Arabic translation of the Islamic secular. That translation uses none of the words that are traditionally used for secular, as secular was imported into the Arabic world, into the Arab world from the West. Words like almaniya, ilmaniya, dunya or dunyawiya. My translation uses none of these words. Instead, my translation is Islam ma wara al-hukm al-shar'i, or Islam kharij al-hukm al-shar'i. That is to say, Islam beyond the realm of what the hukm shar'i can govern concretely, or Islam outside the realm of the hukm shar'i. Now, this particular rendering implies something very important about the relationship between Islam and Sharia. Simply stated, and this is a major argument of my book, Islam and Sharia are not coterminous. We might think of Islam, by coterminous I mean that they're not of the same dimensions. All right? In other words, one may be like this and the other like this. They're not both like this. Is that? Okay. All right. So we might think of Islam as simply the human response to the watchful gaze of the God of Islam. In this capacity, Islam is all-encompassing, totalizing, and covers everything, as nothing falls outside the scope of God's watchful gaze. Sharia, on the other hand, is not totalizing in this way, but rather bounded in the sense that I described above, in that it does not speak to every human contingency, even if it speaks to every area of human life. And I'll explain this in a little bit. This allows for what is perhaps the most counterintuitive aspect of my thesis, namely the possibility of a religious secular. Religious in the sense of remaining within the watchful gaze of the God of Islam. Secular, however, in the sense of being differentiated from what God's revelation has to say in the way of Sharia. So we have what we would refer to as a religious secular. Again, religious in the sense that it comes within the watchful gaze of the God of Islam. Secular, however, that it is not dictated by what God says in Revelation and is translated into Sharia. Now, all of this may be a little abstract, so let me pivot here and bring in the pre-modern Muslim jurist to try to give a clearer sense of how I arrived at this thesis. I'll begin with a basic fact about Sharia. Sharia is simply, or essentially, the sum total of legal rulings, ahkam shar'iyya, that govern the lives of Muslims. A single one of these rulings is called a hukm shar'i. Now, the hukm shar'i is the basic unit of Sharia. As such, Sharia itself can extend only as far as the hukm shar'i will take it. In other words, any limits that the jurists recognize on the hukm shar'i, that is, any recognition of limits on what the hukm shar'i can speak to concretely and authoritatively, are also therefore limits on what Sharia can speak to in concrete authoritative terms. Now, going all the way back over 1,000 years, and I'm just going to give one example here. In the book, there are about 9 or 10 of them. Going back over 1,000 years, beginning with the Maliki jurist, Abu Bakr al-Baqillani, who died in 403 of the Islamic calendar, 1013 of the Common Era. Muslim jurists typically define Sharia as, and I quote, knowledge of the legal, i.e. Shari'i assessments, as opposed to the rational assessments, aqli, governing the lives of legally responsible persons. Almost invariably, they follow this up by distinguishing judgments or assessments that are Shari'i from judgments or assessments that are non-shari'i or aqli, that is, rational. Shari'i judgments are those that are based on the sources of Sharia, that is, the Quran, the Sunnah, and the like. Non-shari'i judgments, on the other hand, are based on sources other than these. For example, the sources from which we come to know grammar, or medicine, or philosophy, or geometry, or how to engage in everyday decision making. For example, what to buy a spouse for a birthday. Clearly, the hukm shari'i, and with it sharia, is limited in what it can speak to concretely and in authoritative terms. And it is important to note in this context that these limitations are not imposed upon sharia from without, that is, from without the Islamic juristic tradition, but are rather openly acknowledged and insisted upon by the Muslim jurists themselves. Now, judgments that are not based on the sources of Sharia are what I identify as differentiated or secular, not in the Western sense, in the sense that I've been talking about. In the micro-secular sense of falling outside of what God's address can cover or speak to in concrete authoritative terms. Among the key takeaways from all of this is that Muslims will not be able to rely on Shari'i judgments alone for everything they need to live their lives Islamically. For so many of the decisions they will have to make, and so many of the ideas and institutions they will have to produce, will not be addressed concretely or authoritatively by the sources of Sharia. In such light, as I see it, among the major misfortunes befalling Muslims in modern times is their internalization of the idea that all Muslims need to do is live their lives within the boundaries of the rules of Sharia, and everything will be all right. Everything will be fine. But this is far from the case. For even within the boundaries of what Sharia permits, bad decisions can be made. And these bad decisions will lead to bad outcomes. Clearly, something beyond the parameters of Sharia must be considered if we are to make good decisions on those issues that fall outside of what Sharia covers in concrete authoritative terms. Now, an old friend of mine, Shihab al-Qarafi, I'm not a vampire, clarifies this point quite nicely. He recalls a discussion among his fellow jurists regarding a certain hadith of the Prophet, ﷺ, wherein the angel Gabriel is said to have come to the Prophet and offered him a choice of between drinking from a chalice of milk or a chalice of wine. The Prophet chose the milk, at which time Gabriel is said to have informed him that had he chosen the wine, his community would have gone astray. Here, however, according to Al-Qarafi, a major question arises. These two actions were clearly equally permissible according to Sharia at that time. And by the way, for those of you who don't know, most scholars say that wine drinking in Islam was not made forbidden until year 4 after the Hijrah. Right? So, these two actions were clearly equally permissible according to Sharia at that time. But how could they be of the same legal status when such drastically different practical consequences attached to them? Al-Qarafi explains that two actions may carry the same legal status while also carrying drastically different practical consequences. And while one can turn to Sharia to learn whether or not an action is permissible, Sharia will not necessarily tell one what the consequences of engaging in that act might be. For example, Al-Qarafi notes that it may be equally permissible to build this house or that house, to marry this woman or man or that woman or man, to buy this pack animal or that pack animal. But in none of these cases will Sharia tell one which choice to make. Which of these houses, which of these men or women, which pack animal will be most beneficial to him or her here and now. Sharia will not dictate that, right? Rather, to be successful regarding these kinds of deliberations, one will need to develop effective decision-making skills and practices, which will rely just as much, if not more, on non-Shari'i, differentiated, rational deliberations as they do on Sharia. In other words, such decision-making skills will be a product not of Sharia, but of the Islamic secular. Again, such non-Shari'i decision-making, while differentiated, will not be secular in the Western sense of being non-religious. For God and God's watchful gaze remain no less relevant to this enterprise than they are to such things as prayer, fasting, or avoiding adultery. This is again why I insist that in contradistinction to the Western secular, or the dominant understanding of secular in the West, the Islamic secular is fundamentally a religious secular. Now, what are some of the implications of all of this? I think they are massive. We don't have enough time to cover all, but let me mention a few by way of example. First, think of all of the things that Sharia requires or permits us to do, but for which it provides no concrete instruction. For example, a man is required to provide for his family financially. That's a requirement of Sharia. It's wajib. But Sharia gives no instruction on how to earn enough money to do so. A woman has a choice of marrying the suitor of her choice, but Sharia provides no concrete instruction beyond general qualifications on how to choose a successful, compatible mate. And we're not talking about compatible religiously. We're talking about compatible in a more intimate sense. I'll just leave it at that, right? A child has a choice to pick whatever career he or she wants, but Sharia provides no instruction in this regard. Sharia does not tell you, you must be a lawyer, you must be a doctor, you must be a teacher. These are things that have to be figured out by individuals on their own. The problem, however, is that when the need for Islamic secular deliberation, is not recognized, and Sharia is believed or understood to provide everything that Muslims need, bad decisions can be made in the name of Sharia. Bad consequences will follow, and then we end up blaming Islam and Sharia for not working. I remained committed to Sharia. I didn't violate Sharia in any way, and yet I don't have the career that I want. I don't have the marriage I want. I don't have the family I want. We don't have the community that we want. Not everything that goes into making these things what we would want them to be is dictated by Sharia. And we cannot rely on Sharia alone to bring those things about. When we overlook the necessity of Islamic secular deliberation, this can ultimately lead to a loss of confidence in both Sharia and Islam. And this will promote secularization in the modern Western sense, as people begin to move away from religion on the understanding that religion, in this case Islam, only frustrates their efforts, only to discover in the end that bad decisions lead to bad consequences, whether one is religious or not. The second thing I want to raise here is, as an example of how important this is think about the early conquest of the Muslim community coming out of Arabia, right? Which produced what we call today the central lands of Islam. A couple of questions. Who drew the maps? Who trained the soldiers? Who treated the wounded? Who developed the weapons? Who developed and oversaw the administrative apparatus? Who kept the records? And so on and so on. Few, if any, of these things are dictated by Sharia. There are no verses in the Quran, no hadith of the Prophet that tell us how to draw maps. These are Islamic secular endeavors. Third, today there is much talk about the need for jihad, or I'm sorry, ijtihad. Was that a Freudian? Whoa. Well, we'll look that one. There's a lot of talk about ijtihad and the need for ijtihad. I'm still thinking about that jihad thing. Anyway, there's a lot of talk about the need for ijtihad. I agree, but only on the right understanding of this. For the fact of the matter is that ijtihad can only produce one thing. And what is that? A hukm shar'i. A hukm shar'i. Ijtihad is based on the sources of Sharia. It will produce a hukm shar'i. Right? But where what is really needed is cultural production, technology development, administrative acumen, wealth production, and the like, ijtihad will be of extremely limited use. Where does the Muslim world lag behind other civilizations today? In religiosity or in these things that I just mentioned? And how is that deficit going to be made up? Now, we can make that deficit up, all right, by borrowing or learning how others do things. The problem, however, is that if that activity is recognized as only secular, what's going to happen to the Muslim community? Over a very short period of time, it will become I'm sorry? Western secularized? Is that what somebody said? Yes. In other words, the sense will be we have to move out of religion to acquire what we need to support religion. All right? So we secularize in order to become more religious. Right? Not a situation one wants to be in. Part of what plagues Islam and the Muslims in the world today is the loss of what Peter Berger referred to as a plausibility structure, through which the meanings and values of religion can resonate with people in the context of the social, cultural, and social political realities that define their everyday lives. Modern culture simply makes it unfashionable to be religious. But the only cure for bad culture is the creation of better culture. But how can cultural creation become the job of Sharia or the ulama? And how can Muslims be made to see cultural production, like wealth production, as a bona fide Islamic religious act, just like jihad or using prayer beads? Once we recognize the importance of the Islamic secular to a proper understanding of Islam, we will understand that the fortunes of Islam, including Sharia, never have and never will fall solely on the shoulders of Islam's ulama or its Sharia. Rather, all of us, those possessed of cultural, administrative, financial, or other talents, have a role to play. More important, we must recognize collectively that the talents we bring to these enterprises are neither secular in the Western sense of being non-religious, nor are they marginal to Islam. Rather, all these things should be esteemed as religious as part of the Islamic secular. I think I'm going to stop here because I have too much to cover in 5 minutes, but hopefully we'll be able to cover some of this in the question and answer period. Thank you very much.
Thank you.